Picture a person who knows something no one else does. Not a genius. Not a prophet. Just a person with information and the discipline to never speak it aloud. For most of history, these people were everywhere. Priests, alchemists, scribes, guildmasters, physicians, cartographers. They weren't always the strongest, or the wealthiest, or the most visible, but they held something harder to take away than land or gold. They understood how the world actually worked, and they told almost no one. This isn't a story about secret societies or hidden conspiracies, though those are part of it. It's a story about something more fundamental, the relationship between information and power. And why, for most of human history, the people who had the most information worked extremely hard to make sure everyone else had less. The systems they built to do that were remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. Egyptian priests and medieval glassmakers and Renaissance alchemists and Athenian mystery cults all converged on the same basic architecture. Tiers of access, years of initiation, oaths of silence, and texts written to be unreadable without a key that was never written down. That convergence is interesting. It suggests these weren't arbitrary choices. It suggests there's something about knowledge itself, the nature of it, the weight of it, that consistently produces the same response in people who hold it. Over the course of this episode, I want to trace how that system developed, how it was maintained, what happened when it was threatened, and what it actually tells us about the way power works, not in the ancient world, but right now. Because the instinct we're looking at didn't disappear. It adapted. And by the end, I want to leave you with a question I genuinely don't know the answer to. One that came up repeatedly while I was researching this, and that I think is more uncomfortable than it first appears. To understand how knowledge became a tool of control, you have to go back to a moment before any of the institutions we'll be talking about existed, before temples, before guilds, before written language, to a world where knowledge was purely oral, which means it was fragile, perishable, and survived only in the memories of specific human beings. In that world, the person who knew things was irreplaceable in a very literal sense. The showman who understood which plants stopped infection and which ones accelerated it wasn't respected because of his spiritual authority. Or not only because of that, he was respected because without him, people died from injuries that didn't have to be fatal. The elder who remembered the migration patterns of animals, the flood cycles of rivers, the signs that predicted drought. She wasn't just wise. She was load-bearing infrastructure. And here's the thing about being load-bearing infrastructure. You start to understand your own value. You start to understand that what you know is not just useful, it's scarce. And scarce useful things in every human society ever studied eventually become currency. We have evidence of this from some of the earliest human communities we can study. Ethnographic research on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living analogs to pre-agricultural humans, consistently shows that ritual specialists, healers, and knowledge keepers occupy distinct social positions. They are fed, protected, exempted from certain kinds of labor. In exchange, they know things. And critically, they control who else gets to know them. This is not a modern invention. This is not capitalism or feudalism or any system that gets named and historicized. This is something older. This is a feature of human social organization so deep and so consistent that it predates everything else we call civilization. The moment knowledge became power, was also the moment it became worth hiding. And hiding it required a technology. In a pre-literate world, that technology was initiation. Initiation is usually described in religious terms as a spiritual transformation, a rite of passage, a death and rebirth. All of those things are true. But initiation is also a very practical information management system. You prove yourself worthy of a secret. Through time, through ordeal, through demonstrated loyalty, and then you receive it. The secret itself is the reward. And having received it, you are now part of the group that benefits from it, remaining secret. This creates a self-reinforcing system. Every person who goes through initiation has an incentive to protect the knowledge, because their status depends on its scarcity. The more people who know something, the less valuable it is to know it. So the initiated become the most reliable guardians of the secrecy that defines them. Anthropologist Victor Turner, writing about initiation rituals across dozens of cultures in the 1960s, noticed something consistent. The content of what's revealed during initiation is often far less important than the fact of revelation itself. The secret can be mundane, a particular story, an object, a name, and still be worth years of preparation, because what matters isn't the information, it's the belonging that comes with receiving it. That distinction between the content of a secret and the social function of having one is going to matter later in this episode. Hold on to it. Writing appeared independently in at least 4 places. Mesopotamia around 3200 BC, Egypt shortly after, China around 1200 BC, and Mesoamerica around 900 BC. The circumstances were different each time, but the social effect was remarkably similar. Writing created the possibility of knowledge that outlived its keeper. For the first time, what a person knew didn't have to die with them. It could be stored, copied, transported, read by someone the original author never met. This sounds like liberation. And eventually, over thousands of years, it became one. But in the short term, in the centuries immediately following the invention of writing in each of these cultures, it actually concentrated knowledge further, because writing required a new kind of specialist. Someone who could read. In Sumer, during the 3rd millennium BC, scribes were among the most privileged members of society. The training required to master cuneiform, a system of several hundred distinct signs, took years and was accessible only to families wealthy enough to support a child through an extended apprenticeship. The Adaba, the Sumerian scribal school, was not a public institution. It was a gateway that most people never approached. And what were the first things written down? Administrative records, grain inventories, tax assessments, temple accounts. The first applications of writing were not to preserve wisdom or record history. They were to track resources, which means the first people with power over writing were the people who controlled what you owned, what you owed, and what you were owed. And if you couldn't read the document, you had to trust them. The scribe who wrote your debt contract was also the only person who could read it back to you. That's not a small thing. Egypt is where the management of knowledge first becomes systematic enough to call it institutional. The Egyptian priestly class wasn't just a religious organization, it was an information monopoly, and it operated with a sophistication that modern organizations would recognize. The priests of the major temples, at Karnak, at Memphis, at Heliopolis, controlled access to knowledge in several overlapping domains simultaneously. Astronomy. They tracked celestial cycles, and used them to predict the flooding of the Nile, which was the single most important agricultural event in Egyptian life. Miss the flood timing, and you miss the planting window. Miss the planting window, and people starve. The priests knew when the flood was coming, and they announced it as divine revelation. They also controlled medicine. Egyptian medical knowledge, as preserved in papyri like the Ebers papyrus from around 1550 BC, was sophisticated. Detailed anatomical observations, hundreds of documented treatments, systematic approaches to diagnosis. This knowledge was not distributed. It was held within the priestly system and accessed through it. Architecture, chemistry, embalming techniques, the production of specific pigments and materials used in ritual contexts, the ability to perform the religious ceremonies on which the pharaoh's legitimacy depended. All of it concentrated inside one institution, organized hierarchically, and transmitted only through controlled channels. And here's the specific technique that I find most interesting: deliberate incompleteness. Some Egyptian ritual texts were written in a form that was intentionally unusable without additional oral instruction. The text contained the words of a ceremony, but not the precise timing, the physical gestures, the materials, or the specific intonation required. It was a record and a decoy simultaneously. If the text fell into the wrong hands, it was useless. The usable knowledge lived in a person, not a document. The Eleusinian Mysteries ran for approximately 1,900 years, from around the 15th century BC to 396 AD, when the Visigoths sacked the sanctuary and the Roman Emperor Theodosius closed all pagan institutions. For nearly 2 millennia, this was one of the most significant religious experiences available in the ancient Mediterranean world. Plato was initiated. So was Cicero, who wrote about the experience in terms suggesting it changed his understanding of death entirely. And we have almost no idea what happened inside. Not because the sources are absent. They're everywhere. The mysteries are mentioned by dozens of ancient authors. Thousands of Athenians went through initiation every year. We have the rough structure, a period of preparation, a procession from Athens to Eleusis, a nighttime ceremony inside the telesterion, a large hall built specifically for the rites. We know certain sacred objects were involved, and a drink called the kaikon, and something that was shown. But the content of the revelation itself, the dromena, the things done, the dakimena, the things shown, the legomena, the things said, was never recorded, as far as we can tell, by anyone who experienced it. In nearly 2,000 years, the oath held. There was one documented exception. Alcibiades, the Athenian general, brilliant and constitutionally incapable of following rules, he considered beneath him, apparently performed a parody of the mysteries at a private party sometime around 415 BC. The accusation contributed to his exile from Athens. The city took the breach seriously enough to make it a political crisis. What the mysteries actually contained remains unknown. The most plausible scholarly theories involve some combination of psychoactive substances, theatrical staging, and a direct confrontation with mortality. Classicist Walter Burkert argued that the experience was essentially impossible to convey in language, that it worked by bypassing verbal understanding entirely, which is why the oath of silence wasn't just a social contract, but a description of the limits of what could be communicated. I find that more interesting than any specific theory about what was shown. The idea that certain kinds of knowledge are structurally resistant to transmission, that they exist only in the moment of direct experience and dissolve the second you try to describe them. That's a claim about the nature of knowledge itself. And it's a claim that shows up in contexts completely unrelated to ancient Greek religion, which is something we'll come back to in later episodes. Moving forward about 1,500 years to medieval Venice, we find a completely secular version of the same architecture, running on purely economic logic. Venetian glassmaking was, by the 13th century, the most technically advanced in Europe. The craftsmen of Murano had developed techniques for producing clear, colorless glass, cristallo, that no one else could replicate. They developed techniques for glass mirrors, for enameling, for producing specific colors with precise chemical consistency. These techniques were the product of generations of accumulated experimentation, of failed batches and ruined furnaces and slow refinements passed from father to son. In 1291, the Venetian Republic relocated all glassmakers to the island of Murano. The official justification was fire safety. The furnaces were a genuine hazard in a city built largely of wood. Endot. ID. It. End. Biest. But the relocation served a second function. It concentrated the craftsmen in one place where they could be monitored, and it made it significantly harder for them to leave. The incentive structure was sophisticated. Murano glassmakers were granted unusual privileges. They could wear swords. Their daughters could marry into Venetian nobility. They were exempt from certain taxes. In exchange, they agreed to remain. A craftsman who revealed trade secrets to a foreign power faced, according to Venetian law, the possibility of having agents dispatched to eliminate him. Whether this threat was carried out in practice is unclear. What's clear is that the knowledge stayed in Venice for several centuries. The techniques eventually leaked, as they always do. By the 16th century, Murano glassmakers had begun emigrating despite the risks, carrying their knowledge to Bohemia, to France, to England. Each emigration started a new regional glass industry. The Venetian monopoly collapsed, not because it was defeated, but because it couldn't contain human beings indefinitely. But what I want to note is the structure of what Venice built. Privileges that made loyalty rewarding, penalties that made defection dangerous, geographic isolation that made surveillance possible, and a clear connection between the collective secrecy and the collective prosperity. Everyone on Murano benefited from the knowledge remaining scarce. Everyone had a stake in keeping it that way. Alchemy has a reputation problem. In popular culture, it's treated as the embarrassing precursor to real chemistry. A collection of magical thinking and wishful metallurgy practiced by credulous medieval men who wanted to make gold and couldn't. This framing is both condescending and inaccurate, and it gets in the way of understanding something genuinely interesting. Alchemists were working chemists. They distilled compounds, performed systematic experiments, documented reactions with consistent terminology, and produced real results. Results that fed directly into the development of formal chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries. Robert Boyle, widely considered a founder of modern chemistry, came out of an alchemical tradition. Isaac Newton spent more time on alchemical experimentation than on physics. His manuscripts on the subject run to over 1 million words. But alchemists worked in a specific context that shaped everything about how they recorded and transmitted their knowledge. They operated in an environment of intense competition for royal patronage, under constant scrutiny from religious authorities who viewed certain kinds of natural philosophy with suspicion and with a genuine belief shared across the tradition that certain knowledge was dangerous in unprepared hands. The response to this context was a system of encryption that worked on at least 3 levels simultaneously. The first level was symbolic substitution. Specific materials and processes were referred to by names drawn from myth, astrology, and religion. Mercury was not just the metal. It was also a principle, and also a deity. And which of these was meant in any given text depended on context that wasn't always provided. The green lion, vitriol, essentially sulfuric acid, in a form that would dissolve metals, appeared in dozens of texts across centuries. Someone who didn't know the code read about a lion. Someone who did had a reagent. The second level was deliberate obscurity of process. Descriptions of procedures were written in the passive voice, with steps out of sequence, with crucial temperatures or durations omitted. A text might describe a reaction in sufficient detail to demonstrate that the author had performed it, while remaining insufficient to reproduce it. The text proved the knowledge existed. It didn't transmit it. The Splendor Solis, the splendor of the sun, is a German alchemical manuscript from the mid-16th century, produced in multiple illuminated copies of exceptional quality. It's held up as a masterpiece of alchemical illustration, and it's studied both by art historians and by scholars trying to reconstruct what it actually described. The manuscript consists of 22 illustrated panels, each depicting a stage of a process. The imagery is precise and consistent across copies, which suggests the illustrations were themselves a form of encoded instruction, a visual language that conveyed specific information to those who knew how to read it, while appearing to uninitiated eyes as religious allegory or decorative art. We have partial modern reconstructions of what the process described. It appears to involve a sequence of chemical transformations, probably related to the preparation of specific compounds, tracked through color changes that the imagery represents symbolically. This imagery represents symbolically the black phase, the white phase, the yellow phase, the red phase. These are stages in a real process, described through the visual grammar of myth. Note 9. The third level of encryption was the one that couldn't be broken by analysis alone, the oral key. Certain information was never written down at all. The practitioner who trained with a master received, in person, the interpretive framework that made the written texts usable. Without that transmission, the texts were not just difficult. They were deliberately constructed to be impossible. This is a remarkable design. Think about what it accomplishes. The written text can be copied, confiscated, or circulated freely, because it's useless without the oral component. The oral component exists only in living people, who can be sworn to secrecy, who have relationships and reputations and skin in the game. The knowledge is protected not by a single lock, but by the combination of an unbreakable cipher and a human being who has chosen to keep a secret. Goo. I said earlier that some alchemists believed certain knowledge was dangerous in unprepared hands. I want to push on that, because it's easy to dismiss as self-serving rationalization. And sometimes it was. But there's a more serious version of the argument. Alchemical knowledge in the 15th and 16th centuries included real information about poisons, about the preparation of corrosive compounds, about substances with significant physiological effects. The overlap between alchemy and toxicology was substantial. Some of what alchemists knew had obvious potential for harm if used without the interpretive context that distinguished therapeutic doses from lethal ones. Compounds with medical applications from compounds that were simply dangerous. Theirs is also the psychological dimension. Several alchemical writers were explicit about the idea that certain operations required mental preparation, that attempting them without proper groundwork would produce distorted results, or worse, would produce correct results in someone who wasn't ready to integrate what they'd found. Whether you find this convincing or not, it was a sincere position held by sophisticated practitioners, and it's worth understanding on its own terms before deciding it's wrong. The alchemical tradition is also where we start to see something that becomes very important later in this series. Texts that were written not to communicate, but to prove. The author demonstrating to an initiated reader that they had arrived somewhere, without providing the directions that would let anyone follow them there. Knowledge as credential rather than instruction. The text as membership card. There's a detail about all the systems we've been looking at that I want to focus on, because I think it's the most revealing thing about the psychology of knowledge control. None of them destroyed what they were hiding. The Egyptian priests kept meticulous records of everything they knew, in archives, in tombs, carved into stone in chambers accessible only to those with authorization. The Eleusinian officials maintained the sanctuary for 19 centuries without the content of the rites ever being officially recorded. If you want information to disappear, you destroy it. That's simple. If you go to the trouble of hiding it, of building institutional structures to control access, of encoding it in multiple layers, of training people specifically to carry it, then you believe it has value. You intend to use it. You're building something that you plan to last. This is the key insight. Knowledge control is not primarily about suppression. It's about preservation combined with restriction. Whoa. The goal is not a world where the knowledge doesn't exist. It's a world where it exists only in specific hands. The knowledge is an asset. The control of who accesses it is the business model. The printing press, Gutenberg's movable type, introduced to Europe around 1440, is usually described as the technology that ended information monopolies. And in one important sense, it did. The ability to produce hundreds of identical copies of a text cheaply and quickly made it impossible to suppress information through simple physical control. There weren't enough people to confiscate every copy, and the copies kept appearing. But I want to make a more precise claim. The printing press didn't end information monopolies. It ended a specific kind of information monopoly, the kind based on physical scarcity of documents. What it created was a different kind of scarcity, interpretive authority. Anyone could now have a copy of the Bible. The question was, whose interpretation of it was legitimate? The Reformation is, among other things, a war over interpretive authority. It's a dispute about who gets to tell you what the text means, and therefore, effectively, who gets to tell you what God wants. Luther's argument was that the individual believer with the text in front of them could determine this for themselves. The Church's argument was that centuries of accumulated interpretive tradition, held by trained clergy, was necessary to read the text correctly. Both positions are, in a sense, arguments about who should control access to knowledge. They just disagree about which layer of the system needs to be controlled. The document, or the framework for reading it. What happened after the printing press is a long series of adaptations. Each time a technology democratized access to information, the systems of control adapted to operate at a different layer. The scientific revolution of the 17th century produced the concept of the published scientific paper, which looks like open knowledge, and in some ways is, but which is also legible primarily to people with years of specialized training. The knowledge is technically public. The ability to evaluate or apply it requires a credential that most people never acquire. The patent system, developed in its modern form in the 18th century, creates a legal monopoly on applied knowledge. You disclose how something works in exchange for exclusive rights to its commercial application. The knowledge becomes public. The power over it remains controlled. The modern classification system for government secrets operates on a tiered access model that would be structurally recognizable to an Egyptian priest. Compartmentalization. Need-to-know restrictions. Clearance levels that determine what layer of information you can see. The mechanisms are different. The logic is identical. Knowledge that is valuable is worth controlling access to. And access can always be controlled at some layer of the system, even if the underlying information is widely available. What changes across history is which layer is the bottleneck. In the ancient world, physical possession of the document. After the printing press, interpretive authority. After universal literacy, specialized vocabulary and training. In the digital age, attention, curation, and algorithmic access. The information is everywhere. Knowing which of it is real, which of it matters, and what it means requires frameworks that are themselves not equally distributed. I want to slow down and push back against the framing this episode has been implicitly building toward. Because the easy read of everything we've discussed is powerful institutions hoarded knowledge to maintain control. And this was bad. And sometimes, that's precisely what happened. The history of knowledge control contains genuine suppression, genuine harm, genuine injustice, and we'll get to some of the starkest examples of that in the next episode. End quote. But the case for restriction is not always cynical. And understanding why it sometimes isn't is important for evaluating the systems we live inside right now. The Egyptian priest spent 20 years accumulating medical knowledge. He had seen treatments applied incorrectly and kill patients. He had watched compounds prepared without sufficient precision produce outcomes that ranged from ineffective to fatal. His argument for restricting access to that knowledge wasn't purely self-interested, or wasn't only self-interested. It was also an argument from experience. This knowledge requires a context to be useful, and that context takes years to build. The Venetian glassmaker's argument was more purely economic. The techniques his family spent generations developing were their livelihood. Why would he give them away? We don't expect a software company to open source its core product. We don't expect a pharmaceutical company to publish its synthesis routes for free. The principle that people have a right to benefit from their intellectual labor is not obviously wrong, even if its applications are often contested. The alchemist's argument was stranger, but also worth taking seriously. Some processes, encountered without preparation, produce outcomes the practitioner is not equipped to handle, whether that's a claim about psychological readiness, or about the practical danger of certain substances, or about something more metaphysical. It represents a genuine position about the relationship between the person and the knowledge. And you. Each of these arguments is rational on its own terms. Each of them is also, simultaneously, a structure that concentrates power. And that's not a coincidence. It's the tension at the center of every system of knowledge management that has ever existed. You cannot have a framework that says some people should have access to certain knowledge, and others shouldn't, without creating a group that decides who's in which category. And that group, by definition, by the logic of the system, has interests. And those interests are not always aligned with the interests of the people whose access they're managing. The question isn't whether any restriction of knowledge is ever justified. In some form, in some contexts, it probably is, Though where exactly that line falls is one of the most contested questions in human political life. The question is, who decides? And what prevents the people who decide from deciding in their own favor? In the ancient world, the answer to that question was usually nothing, or the gods, or tradition, which are all functionally the same answer. The system is self-legitimating, and there is no external check. We've built more elaborate answers since then. Democratic accountability, press freedom, academic peer review, open source software, whistleblower protections. Each of these is an attempt to create a check on the power of knowledge holders, a mechanism by which the people outside the system can evaluate whether the people inside it are behaving in the collective interest or their own. Some of those mechanisms work better than others. All of them are contested. All of them have failure modes. And in every case, the people who benefit most from the current distribution of access have the strongest incentives to argue that the current distribution is correct. Throughout everything we've looked at today, there's one thing that's been consistent. The people who controlled knowledge believed that what they held was worth protecting, worth the complexity of initiation systems, the risk of encrypted texts, the cost of isolation and oath-keeping, and generation after generation of careful transmission. Most of the time, I think the historical record suggests they were protecting an economic position more than they were protecting anything inherently dangerous. The knowledge itself, once it eventually spread, and it always eventually spread, usually turned out to be useful rather than catastrophic. Open science moved faster than secret science. Shared techniques produce better outcomes than hoarded ones. But there's a harder version of this story. The one that came up repeatedly while I was researching this, that I couldn't quite put aside. Because in all these cases, the priests, the mystery cults, the guilds, the alchemists, the assumption is that the people controlling the knowledge understood what they had. That they were managing something they've discovered and verified and knew how to use. That the secrecy was a deliberate choice made from a position of comprehension. What about when that wasn't true? What about the cases where the knowledge was copied, or inherited, or received from somewhere the original holder couldn't quite account for, and the secrecy wasn't chosen, it was imposed, where the text was hidden not because the author wanted to control it, but because the author didn't fully understand what they'd written? That's a different kind of story, and it's the one the next episode will start to tell. In episode 2, we're going to look at what happens when the people trying to protect knowledge lose, when libraries burn, when scholars are killed for what they know, when centuries of accumulated understanding disappear inside a single generation, and whether any of it was actually lost, or whether loss is ever really what it looks like from the outside. And somewhere in the middle of that, we're going to find the first evidence of the thing that unsettles me most about this whole subject. The first indication that some of what got hidden wasn't hidden by its authors. That some of it was hidden because no one, including the person who wrote it, knew what it was.